Dick Cabesa pulled his faded gray fedora down low over his eyes as he steered his beat-up Chevy down the quiet country road. It had been a long drive from the city out to the remote town of Mayberry, a place that seemed frozen in time, where life moved at a slower pace, untouched by the rushing currents of modernity. He was here on a case, a missing woman named Mary Bloom. The call had come in from an elderly widow, a Mrs. Miller, about a week ago. Not much to go on, but something about the pleading desperation in the old woman's voice had compelled him to take the job. Besides, after 25 years as a private eye, chasing down cheating spouses and insurance fraudsters, a case with a bit of mystery was a welcome change of pace. Cabesa pulled the Chevy up to the curb outside 21 Baker Street, killing the rumbling engine. He stepped out, surveying the scene, a quaint suburban home, white wooden siding peeling with age, slate stepping stones leading up to a modest porch. A creeping vine wound its way up the side, picturesque, yet somehow unsettling in its perfection, like a postcard of a bygone era. Before he could even ascend the steps, the front door swung open. "Hello, young man," called a lilting, aged voice. Mrs. Miller stood framed in the doorway, skin deeply wrinkled and tanned, her thin lips pulled tight in a welcoming smile. A single silver braid draped over her shoulder, striking blue eyes sizing him up. "You must be Mr. Cabesa. Please come inside." "I'm so glad you came." "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am," Cabesa replied with a tip of his hat as he stepped into the foyer. The interior was like stepping back in time. Floral print armchairs, a love seat, a wooden coffee table. Family photos and knickknacks adorned the mantel, quaint and homey. "Would you care for some tea, Mr. Cabesa?" Mrs. Miller asked, closing the door behind them. "No thank you, ma'am. I noticed a diner on my way into town. I was planning to stop by later. Ask around about Miss Bloom." "Oh, Mary!" Quiet, pained exclamation. "Please sit." She gestured to an armchair as she lowered herself onto the couch. "As I told you on the telephone, she's been missing quite some time." Her gaze grew distant as she absently fingered the hem of her apron. "Mary was such a sweet girl. Lived over on Drury Lane. She used to bring me sweets on Sundays after church. Spend time with me. Oh, what a lovely girl." Cabesa withdrew a small notepad and pen from his coat pocket. "Mrs. Miller, any information you can provide about Miss Bloom will be greatly appreciated. When was the last time you saw her?" "Maybe a week ago," the old woman replied, brow furrowing. "And then she just stopped coming by. I knew something was wrong." "How long had Miss Bloom been visiting you?" "Oh, some years now. 8 perhaps." Cabesa jotted down notes. "Is it possible she's just been busy? Occupied with other things?" Mrs. Miller fixed him with a skeptical look. "I asked around town. She's nowhere to be seen." "So you don't believe she left of her own accord?" A statement, not a question. "I'm not certain what's happened, Inspector. That's your job to find out. But I know Mary. She was a sweet girl. If she was leaving town, she would have said goodbye." Cabesa nodded, hearing the undercurrent of distress in the old woman's voice. He stood, placing his hat back atop his head. "If I need anything else, I'll be sure to come by Mrs. Miller. I'll do my best to get to the bottom of this." With that, he took his leave, striding back out to the Chevy. Next stop, the local diner. Time to see what the townsfolk knew about Mary Bloom. The drive was short. As Cabesa stepped into the homey diner, the aroma of frying oil and sizzling meat made his empty stomach growl. He slid into a vinyl booth as a plump, rosy-cheeked waitress in a red uniform approached, beaming smile on her face. "Well, hello there. I'm Audrey. What can I get ya? What's the house specialty?" Cabesa asked with a crooked grin. Audrey laughed. "Oh, that'd be our ultimate burger, big juicy patty. Cheese, bacon, egg, the works. Comes with a side of fries. Perfect. I'll take one of those and a beer. Comin' right up, hun." She turned to go, but Cabesa caught her arm. "Oh, and is the owner around? Like to have a word with him if I could." Audrey nodded. "Sure thing. I'll send Mr. Stanley right over." A few minutes later, a tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair approached the booth. He extended a hand. Hank Stanley. I'm the owner. Audrey said you wanted to speak with me? Dick Cabesa, private investigator. He shook the proffered hand firmly. I'm looking into the disappearance of a local woman, Mary Bloom. Thought you might be able to help me out. Stanley's eyes widened slightly as he slid into the booth across from Cabesa. Mary Bloom? Yeah, I knew her. Heck, everybody did. We went to high school together. When was the last time you saw her? Stanley scratched his chin. Couldn't say for sure. Maybe a month ago? She used to come in for coffee now and then. At that moment, Audrey returned with Cabesa's burger and beer. Overhearing, she interjected. You're looking for Mary? I heard she had an abusive boyfriend, always wearing long sleeves even in summer. Rumor is, he was a real piece of work. That's enough gossip, Audrey. Stanley cut in with a stern look. Let the man eat. It's all right, Cabesa said, waving dismissively. Audrey's tidbit had piqued his interest. He looked at her intently. This boyfriend got a name? Pierce, I think, she replied. Don't know much else. Cabesa turned back to Stanley. You know anything about this Pierce character? Stanley shook his head. I try not to put much stock in rumors and hearsay. Mary seemed like a nice girl, but I didn't know her all that well. Anyone else who might have information? Someone closer to her. You might try Christopher Blythe over at the post office, Stanley suggested. Think they spent some time together. If anyone knows anything, might be him. Cabesa thanked Stanley for his time, then tucked into the enormous, greasy burger. His mind chewed over the details as he ate. An abusive boyfriend named Pierce. A girl who spent a lot of time with the postman. A town where everybody seemed to know Mary Bloom, but details were scarce. The burger demolished, Cabesa left cash on the table and set out for the post office, Audrey calling out a cheery good luck as the bell over the door rang out. Inside the cramped, musty post office, Cabesa found Christopher Blythe, a spindly man with thinning hair merrily sorting letters. Mr. Blythe? Dick Cabesa, private investigator. Got a minute? Blythe started slightly, peering at Cabesa over his half-moon glasses. Investigator? What's this about? Mary Bloom. I'm looking into her disappearance. Heard you two were close. Blythe set down his letters, suddenly solemn. Ah, Mary. Yes, we were friends, I suppose you could say. Used to see her nearly every day when she came for her mail. Then she just stopped coming round. Tell me about her, Cabesa probed gently. What was she like? A sad smile played on the postman's thin lips. Bright girl, full of life and always kind. But, he dropped his voice. Keep this between us, but I sensed something was troubling her. She'd come in with fresh bruises now and then. Never said much, but I gathered it was her boyfriend's doing. Pierce. Blythe nodded grimly. That's the one. Mean son of a bitch from what I heard. Mary never spoke ill of him, but you could see the fear in her eyes some days. Cabesa felt his gut tighten. Any idea where I might find this Pierce? Couldn't say. He didn't live in town far as I know. Drifter type. Blythe sighed deeply, eyes glistening. I hope you find her, Mr. Cabesa. Mary deserves better than this. Cabesa nodded solemnly. I'll do my best. Thanks for your help. As he stepped back out onto Main Street, a bit of the quaintness of Mayberry felt like it had chipped away, revealing something rotten underneath. He spent the rest of the day poking around town, piecing together bits of Mary's story. The grocer remembered her as a lovely young woman who had gradually grown more withdrawn and skittish. The librarian noted she'd stopped coming in for her usual stack of romance novels. And the little old lady who ran the antique shop swore she'd seen bruises on Mary's wrists on more than one occasion. But concrete facts remained infuriatingly out of reach. No one knew much about the elusive Pierce beyond whispered rumors. No one had seen Mary leave town, and no missing persons report had ever been filed. As the sun began to set over the idyllic streets, Cabesa headed to Mayberry's Soul Motel to get a room for the night, head spinning. Tomorrow would mean a visit to the town archives to dig through records. see if he could find any paper trail on Mary or Pierce. But his gut told him something darker was at play here. In this postcard town seemingly carved out of a Norman Rockwell painting, a serpent lurked unseen in the grass, and it had already struck once. Cabesa tossed and turned in the lumpy motel bed that night, mind racing through scenarios, trying to slot puzzle pieces together. When sleep finally came, it brought uneasy dreams of a girl with Mary's face and sad eyes, endlessly running down darkened streets, a sinister shadow forever at her heels. The next morning saw Cabesa striding into Mayberry's town hall just as it opened, the tang of cheap, burnt coffee wafting from the cup in his hand. A bespectacled clerk retrieved a dusty box of records for him with an air of bored efficiency. Everything on Mary Bloom they had on file. He settled in at a cramped desk in the records room and started sifting, quickly realizing just how many stones had been left unturned in Mary's disappearance. There was no missing persons report, no police investigation, not even an article in the Mayberry Gazette despite her being a lifelong resident. But as he delved deeper into the yellowed news clippings and faded documents, a different story began to take shape. Hospital reports of a Jane Doe admitted 5 years back, a woman matching Mary's description, with signs of severe physical abuse. Incident reports of domestic disputes at a trailer on the outskirts of town, the names frustratingly redacted. Whispers of other girls who had gone missing over the years, drifters, runaways, women on the edges of society that no one would miss. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture taking shape filled Cabesa with a slowly dawning dread. He came to the final document in the box and felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. It was an obituary clipped from the Mayberry Gazette. 10 years old, for a young woman named Marian Miller, Mrs. Miller's daughter, dead at 25 years old. The details were suspiciously sparse, saying only that she had passed away suddenly. But there, in the grainy black and white photo, was the face of Mary Bloom, staring out from the page with those same sad, deep pool eyes. In a flash, horrifying clarity crashed over Cabesa like a frigid wave. Mary Bloom and Marian Miller were the same person, which meant his client, Mrs. Miller, had been sending him chasing after a ghost. Pulse pounding, Cabesa rifled through the other records with panicked urgency, his worst suspicions coalescing into awful certainty. Medical examiner's report on Marian Miller. Deceased, blunt force trauma to the head, suspicious circumstances. Cause of death left as accidental. Missing persons report on one Jeffrey Pierce, filed 10 years ago, a known associate of Marianne. Circumstantial evidence pointed to his involvement in her death, but never enough to make an arrest. Dropped off the face of the earth immediately after. Cabesa collapsed back in his chair, a shaky hand combing through his hair as the truth settled over him like a suffocating pall. Mary Bloom wasn't missing. She had been dead for a decade, killed by her abuser, and her mother, trapped in a prison of grief and delusion, had concocted a fantasy to keep her daughter alive. With a heavy heart and heavier steps, Cabesa made his way back to the Miller house on Baker Street, an awful finality pressing down on him. This was the part of the job he hated most. Mrs. Miller greeted him at the door with that same dulcet cheeriness, seemingly oblivious to the world-ending revelations clutched in his sweaty hands. "Mr. Cabesa, please come in. Any news about Mary?" He stepped inside and took off his hat, meeting her eager gaze with solemn eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I think you'd better sit down. I found some things you need to know about your daughter." Carefully, gently as he could, Cabesa laid out the documents on the coffee table, explained what he'd found, that Marianne and Mary were one and the same, that she hadn't disappeared last week, but passed away 10 years ago, likely at the hands of the man she feared. He watched Mrs. Miller's face journey from confusion to dawning realization, to mute, anguished horror as the fantasy she'd built brick by brick finally crumbled away. Hot tears spilled silently down lined cheeks. "I'm so sorry," Cabesa said softly, reaching out to lay a hand over her trembling ones. "I can't imagine how painful this must be. But Marianne, she's gone. As much as we might wish it, we can't bring back those we've lost. It's not possible." Mrs. Miller croaked, a small, broken sound. "I just talked to her. She was here. I think," Cabesa began carefully, "that losing her was more than anyone should have to bear, and so, to cope with the grief, your mind, it created a fiction. Let you continue seeing her as if she was still here." He squeezed her hand gently. "But she deserves to be at peace now, and you deserve to heal, to honor her memory without being shackled to this false hope." Mrs. Miller seemed to crumple in on herself then, folding forward until her face was buried in her hands, shoulders quaking with silent sobs. Cabesa stayed with her for a long time, a stalwart presence as the most awful of truths sank in. When her tears were finally spent, he pressed a card into her weathered palm with the name of a grief counselor. "I think it would do you good to talk to someone, to process all this. Don't let her death be in vain. Honor her by living." Red-rimmed blue eyes met his. "I'll try," Mrs. Miller whispered. "And thank you, Mr. Cabesa, for finding the truth, even if it's not the one I wanted." Cabesa drove away from Mayberry that evening. Fedora pulled low, a melancholy tune drifting from the radio. The missing woman had been found, the truth uncovered. But it was a bitter victory. The killer had slithered away into the shadows years ago, likely to strike again in some other unsuspecting town. And a mother would have to learn to grieve her daughter all over again. But perhaps, Cabesa mused, there was solace to be found in the finality of knowing. A chance for the soul to settle, for ghosts to be put to rest, and for the living to find their way forward, even in the wake of tragedy. He hoped Mrs. Miller would find that peace, and he vowed that if he ever crossed paths with Jeffrey Pierce, he'd see to it that he rotted in a cell for the rest of his miserable life. It was all he could do, for Mayberry, for Marianne, for every voiceless victim swallowed up by malevolence far too often left unchecked. As the Chevy roared to life, the fading light of the mournful eve gave way to the inkier black of night.